Hello everyone and welcome to the third live talkcast for June in just this last week really. So I've been, I was going to say inundated, but that's not a nice word to use. I've been gifted with many very interesting questions over the last few days and I thought I'll do a final one for this month. I seem to do live streams in spurts now and again over the course of a year. Sometimes I'll do a whole bunch in a row and then there'll be a drought during which I do not do any. And so I have a number of questions to get through today already from Twitter. But as people begin to join the chat, they can feel free to also ask me questions there, or if any new ones appear on Twitter, then I will respond to those as well. But there is much to get through. Let's just say that to begin with, in terms of what people have asked me on Twitter surrounding similar topics, as always, which I don't mind. We can talk about the same things over and again because they're usually the things where the misconceptions tend to arise, or they're just open questions and everyone's opinion is almost as good as anyone else as long as we're committed to rationality and reason. So I'm not going to take these questions in any particular order. I'm just going to sort of pick from random and we'll see if we can get through as many of the Twitter questions as we possibly can. Let's begin with Convex Bets, and Convex Bets has asked, is a system such as a Tesla autopilot, which uses video input from the cameras to train the end-to-end neural network to drive the car, basically using induction to develop the knowledge needed to drive the car, or is it doing something more or something else? Do you think it is possible to have a system that can drive a car in all conditions at least 10 times more safely in terms of miles per accident than an average human driver with this approach? Or do you think this is not possible without AGI? So I think I've got three questions there to go through. So let me begin with the first part about, is the Tesla autopilot using induction in order to learn? No. How do we know that? Because induction's not possible. Induction is the idea that from the past, we can observe things occurring repeatedly, and from that, extrapolate to an explanatory theory, to knowledge. Induction purports, in epistemology, to go beyond mere extrapolation into explanations. After all, anyone can, and I've talked about this so often before, and there is an article on my website about induction, and when I come to edit this, I'll throw a picture of that particular page up. Look up Brett Hall induction. I've talked about this so many times before, but let me use the example. The example is if you were to plot a graph of water being heated over a stove every minute or so, before it reaches boiling point, what you will tend to find is a lovely linear trend. Now, on induction, looking at the past data, which is a straight line graph, then you could draw a line through that straight line graph and predict that as you add more heat to the liquid water, you will continue to get the same pattern. You can generalize, extrapolate, use induction, purportedly, in order to figure out what the temperature of the water will be in 50 minutes' time, let's say. And let's say the temperature of the water is going up 10 degrees Celsius per minute. Then you might very well predict that in 15 minutes from now, the temperature of the water is 180 degrees Celsius. That's your prediction given the straight line extrapolation. Now, how did you arrive at that? Well, only given the explanation you already have, and the explanation you already have, regardless of induction, is that water when heated must follow this straight line graph. That's already, you've already conjectured that. And now you're just confirming, for want of another term, what your theory is. Now, of course, if you actually do the experiment, you're going to be roundly disappointed and refuted because, as we all know, water at approximately sea level on a typical day, standard temperature and pressure, will boil at 100 degrees Celsius and the temperature will not rise. So induction couldn't have told you that. No amount of extrapolating from the past data could you have gotten to what really happens. Now, in order to get to what really happens, we're not after just a prediction of what is going to happen to the temperature, but rather an understanding of the explanation to do with molecular bonding of H2O molecules, this thing called latent heat, and as something boils, the behavior of the bulk liquid. There's a huge explanatory theory, a complicated explanatory theory that does not come to us from what is known as induction, the generalizing of data into an explanatory theory, impossible, but rather a conjectured explanation, which is then tested against reality. And the testing against reality is done by actually trying to increase the temperature of the water off into 180 degrees Celsius, which is what you might have made a prediction that the water was going to be. The water, liquid water, under normal conditions of normal air pressure will never reach 180 degrees Celsius. If you pressurize the air, you might be able to get there. And so as water boils and you continue to heat it, the temperature does not rise. So this is my go-to example, my tired example of why induction not only doesn't work in that situation, but never works anytime, anywhere. Because to extrapolate to begin with, you need an explanatory theory. So a Tesla is not using an impossible means of creating knowledge. In fact, it's not creating knowledge at all. It's not creative. What it's kind of like is a Roomba. Okay, Roombas have been around for a while now, robotic vacuum cleaners that go wandering around your house. And the first time that you put the Roomba on, you can set it to a particular setting where it will generate a map inside of its head of your, inside of its head. It'll generate a map inside of its circuitry, inside of its memory, using AI, using a program, in order to build up this map of your house, so that the next time that you run it, it is far more efficient. It knows where the walls are, it knows where the stairs are, and all this kind of thing. And whatever the case, the Roomba will learn what your house is like. Now, would we say that it has created knowledge? I wouldn't. The knowledge that has been created was placed in there by the programmers. The programmers were the ones that designed the Roomba as a map-making machine. And so, of course, it is going to follow the instructions about how to make a particular map. It's a map-making machine in general. You put it into your house and it makes a specific map. Unsurprising. It follows slavishly its programming, its code, in order to produce the output required, the output that you expect. So too with the Tesla. Thank goodness. You want it to not be creative, because to be creative would allow it to create explanatory knowledge and then decide it doesn't want to do what you want it to do. Avoid obstacles, travel at a particular velocity, turn the corner when the corner arrives, all this kind of stuff that the autopilot should do. In other words, be committed to nothing but driving the car. So I do not call this creating knowledge, but rather gathering information very quickly about its environment in order to safely transport you from point A to point B. Why wouldn't I call that knowledge? Well, we're not necessarily splitting hairs, but what we're talking about is the difference between gathering data, unorganized kind of information, rather than generating an explanation, which is what knowledge creation, as we normally talk about it, amounts to. There's another kind of knowledge creation, which is the biological knowledge creation. But the knowledge of how to avoid an obstacle, how to maintain a particular speed, how to turn a corner, all of these things that the Tesla autopilot can do, were knowledge instantiated into its code, but discovered or programmed by an engineer, a software engineer, earlier and elsewhere. So you can call it an end-to-end, well, it's a neural network, if you like. It's a piece of software that is able to learn about its environment. Again, learn there is used in with some proviso. Okay? We now begin to distinguish between training and learning being conjecturing an explanation, conjecturing an idea and trying to refute it, and training simply being fed lots and lots of data, which is then stored into memory. Much like a fluid can be poured into a bucket, but this is not like what learning is, which is not the fluid being poured into a bucket idea. But if you're simply loading data into a particular system, then it does more resemble the old bucket theory of knowledge idea. But this is not the way in which knowledge is created or the way in which knowledge is learned. Those two things are the same. The second part of the question, so do I think the car is using induction? No. Is it doing something more or something else? It's doing something else. It is using pre-existing explanatory knowledge encoded into the programming which guides the autopilot in order to perform the function that you want it to. And you don't want it to do anything else. You don't want it to go explaining things, being creative, because were it to do that, then it would disobey its own code. It could choose to not avoid the obstacle, let's say, which I guess comes into the second part of your question here, which says, do you think it is possible to have a system that can drive a car in all conditions at least 10 times more safely in terms of mile per accident than an average human driver with this approach? Or do you think it's not possible without AGI? Okay, so an AGI would be a person and would be, I presume, an AGI being a person, we can't distinguish between the different kinds of people except what their substrate might be, which is going to make no difference in any fundamental sense to their functionality, what they're doing. But the thing about AGI is that they're going to be highly prone to error because they will be conjecturing. I would not want an AGI to be driving my Tesla, to be the autopilot, because they wouldn't be an autopilot. They would be a person. So there'd be no difference really between an AGI and a regular GI, a person, except what the substrate would be. What we want with an autopilot is a close as perfectly obedient as possible system which is going to do nothing but drive. An AGI can be distracted. An AGI is a person, and people get distracted. This is the whole problem of people driving and why we want autopilots ultimately to take over. So never mind the AI being 10 times more safe, I would expect 1,000,000 times more safe, quite literally. That an AI system, autopilot, which is networked into some sort of grid that operates at the speed of light, which is able to notice all other vehicles on all roads within some particular radius, and able to account for, what's coming up at the next crossroad, where the pedestrians are. There'd have to be some system of monitoring that is better even than the present set of Teslas have. Teslas have obviously sensors around the entire vehicle, checking for things like pedestrians and the trash can that you go past and the set of lights that's coming up. We can imagine that becoming ever better. And we can also imagine the autopilot being ever more proficient and obedient at being able to get you safely from point A to point B. Unlike a person, a personal driver, who is going to get bored, look out the window and get distracted, take their eyes off the road, be drunk or be angry, not have sufficient coffee, have too much coffee. As you talk to them, maybe they start thinking about something else. They're upset because of things that have happened at home. 1,001 things that could intrude into the mind of a regular person who is driving, or an AGI who would be a person, because they're thinking creatively about other problems. Problems other than, how do I get from A to B safely and efficiently? An AI, a very good Tesla autopilot, would do nothing but, focus is the wrong word because that invokes consciousness, do nothing but implement the program of getting from A to B, utilizing whatever instructions are in the program that is controlling the wheels of the car. And it wouldn't be, as I say, 10 times more safe than a person. but a million times more safe. They'd be able to get from A to B faster. You would never get anywhere near having a head-on accident because the thing would be reacting with reflexes so much faster than what any human being could do. So I'm looking forward to that day. That day is coming, and that day will happen long before, well, I shouldn't say long before, that day happens independent of any research going on with AGI, because this is an AI problem, not an AGI problem. We don't want creative AI. We don't want autopilots to be creative. We can't possibly... We already have autopilots, very, very good autopilots for aircraft, obviously, and for cars. But you might say, but don't you want it to be able to think creatively in case it encounters a problem which the programmers haven't thought about? But that's always the case. That's always the case. Problems not foreseen are an issue for AI and AGI both. In all cases, problems are parochial, they're problems for people. We are the entities that have problems. The AI are a tool that help us to assist us to solve our problems. But they can only solve problems where we have thought about what the potential problems are going to be. So all of the things that you think might happen or go wrong on the road, that's what you encode into a test on. You go, well, if only you could give the test, the creative capacity to solve the unknown problem. Well, you're back at the same position. It would be no better than a human being in that case. A human being driving along, encountering a problem that's never been seen before, how would they react? They'd react exactly the same way as anyone who didn't have information about that unknown thing. Suddenly the huge octopus falls from the sky. What do you do? Well, a person presumably recognizes that as an obstacle. Well, the same thing with the AI-controlled vehicle. But I can't think off the top of my head what would be a problem unforeseen, but there would be problems unforeseen that people who program autopilots would be tripped up by if you could somehow orchestrate that. But hopefully there is a fail-safe within the autopilot such that if that kind of thing happens, there is a thing where it just brings the car to a halt, or not. Maybe you want the car to accelerate. If there's an avalanche beside you, you want the car to go faster rather than the car to slow down. Maybe, are these things thought about? Presumably they are by AI autopilot coders. Okay, let's keep going. Convex Bets again has asked, BOI by David Deutsch is one of the books that Sam Altman has openly recommended people to read. I cannot reconcile this with his recent prophecy of having systems soon that we will be able to ask to figure out all of physics. Do you think he actually believes this, or is he just gaslighting for fundraising, regulatory capture, or some other reason? Well, I can't speak to the last bit. I don't know. I'm not in his mind. There's no possible way I can figure that out. There's a misconception there, but it is a pervasive misconception. It's not just Sam Altman. I've heard many people, physicists included, saying things like, you hear it all the time, something synonymous with the idea of completed science, that if the researchers continue to work hard enough, then they will tie up into a nice neat bow, some area of science, physical chemistry, cosmology, particle physics, whatever it happens to be, so that there will be no open questions. And it betrays a deep misconception about what the nature of science is. That when we find a solution to something, it opens up a window onto a whole bunch of new questions that we weren't able to ask before because we didn't have the language, we didn't have the concepts, we didn't have the understanding. Prior to the idea of space itself space-time being a fabric that could bend and weave, there was no way of conceiving of how space could stretch and expand, much less accelerate. And so it was only once we had an explanation of general relativity, the idea of space-time, and how space itself was this physical entity that has properties, could you then have an understanding that things like mysteries like an accelerating universe could even be conceivable. Because otherwise you could be thinking things like, you see a star there that's moving away with a redshift. It's moving through space. Because it would never enter your mind that space itself could be the thing that would be expanding and causing redshifts. But given a dynamic and really existing space, fabric of space, fabric in scare quotes, then you can conceive of space expanding and contracting, that kind of thing. So when people say things like, Sam Altman did say, we will have AI that is able to figure out all of physics, it makes one wonder what they're thinking in terms of this. It's becoming outdated, I think. Idea of a theory of everything, the reductionist theory of everything, that we unify the fundamental forces. Okay, the fundamental forces at the moment being the electroweak force, the strong force, and we've got gravity, which is out there as not actually a force, but it's sometimes bundled in with the others. But if the particle physicists, some of them anyway, insist that gravity must ultimately be quantized in some way, there must be this particle called the graviton, and then we unite all of these anyway, and we unite these forces, and we have the theory of everything. But in fact, that wouldn't be the end even of particle physics, because we would ask why the parameters are the way they are, why the values of the constants are what they have, why the magnitudes of the forces are what they are, why that theory and not some other theory of everything, and so on it goes. There can be no end to physics. There can be no end to science. Every problem solved reveals new problems yet to be answered. Every solution reveals more of our ignorance. Two things happen simultaneously in the creation of knowledge. Both an increase in what we know by reducing our ignorance in a particular area, and the opening of a window, which we didn't know was there before, onto a vista of problems which we couldn't have conceived of beforehand. Instead of windows, it might be better to think of doors. We pass through a door, we've unlocked it with our solution, to step into a room which just has more doors. And all of those doors represent problems in this analogy. And that is what happens in physics. That you come up with an explanation of gravity, and then you realize that explanation allows for things like black holes, or neutron stars, an expanding universe, an accelerating universe, a universe that must have began hot and dense. And so the possibility of technology and harnessing these things. So there are many more problems are revealed to you. My quip on this on Twitter was something to the effect of, the idea that you can figure out all of physics, to go to, the chat GPT 7.0 or something, and to say, tell me the ultimate solutions to the universe, tell me all of physics, would be exactly like saying to it, tell me all of the numbers. Everyone should immediately be able to see that to ask ChatGPT to tell you all the numbers is a ludicrous thing to say. You will never get to the end, obviously. Not only will you never get to the end, even if you were to confine yourself to the integers, but there are different kinds of numbers. Do you mean complex numbers? Do you mean real numbers? Do you mean rational numbers? At least, or could there be other numbers beyond those numbers that we've thought of? Different orders of infinity, that kind of thing. We can never rule out new abstract entities being discovered. But more than that, the analogy simply is, we're only ever at the beginning of infinity when it comes to talking about numbers. We know, as a matter of fact, there are more numbers. And but by not a perfect one-to-one correspondence between that idea and what physics is all about, we can nonetheless have some insight into what it means to have an explanation of something. Because to have an explanation of something means to reveal to your conscious self a model of the way in which the universe works in some way. But you will always have questions about why that model, and that model will often buttress up against some other model that you have, some other explanation you have, which means they won't fit together. And we are in that situation right now. Quantum theory and general relativity. Many ways of explaining the ways in which they butt heads, so to speak. One is the discrete versus the continuous. Another is to just say, can you know the location of a specific object in space with arbitrarily high precision? General relativity would require you to do that in order for it to make the predictions that it does. Classically, it's a classical theory. But quantum theory says that no, you can't know arbitrarily with high precision what the position of something is. Whatever the theory is that is going to succeed general relativity and quantum field theory, let's say, there is no guarantee that it is not going to contradict some other strongly held explanation of reality somewhere, that we're not going to be in an unproblematic state. The history of science and ideas tells us that we are always in a problematic state. We move from misconception to better misconception, as David Deutsch says. There will always be open questions, and this is a positive view of reality in our circumstance, is that not having a final theory means that there's always more progress to make, because there will always be errors to correct. That's a wonderful thing. Wonderful thing. So, yeah, I don't know what Sam Altman's motivation is. I don't think he has any sort of deep, dark motivation. But all I can say about that particular claim, figure out all of physics, is it just contains a misconception about what science is. One may as well say, figure out all of history, or figure out all of biology. I guess people think that that's also possible. Figure out all of mathematics, etc., figure out all of art. Many people have read The Beginning of Infinity and recommended it. You know, Mark Zuckerberg has as well. I guess Elon Musk at this point may have. Sam Harris, Steven Pinker, you know, many great luminaries, contemporary luminaries in the intellectual world have recommended the book, and some seem to have a better understanding than others. But what many of them share is, I think, a tendency to, and we all do this, when reading a book, to read into the book what you expect to be there. And The Beginning of Infinity contains many countercultural and counter-common sense ideas. And so it can be so psychologically jarring for many people that their mind can tend to skip over the challenging parts and to fill in those gaps with their preconceived ideas about how the world must work. And so I have encountered people who, you know, will have read The Beginning of Infinity, and will say they've read The Beginning of Infinity, understand The Beginning of Infinity, but then insist things like, nonetheless, there must be a superintelligence out there somewhere. Well, that superintelligence is possible. Completely missing this idea, which is so central to the themes throughout The Beginning of Infinity, of universality and explanatory universality. And once you really understand that, then you recognize that there can be no superintelligence. All you can do is augment the speed at which you think and the memory that you have. But once a system is creative, you know, able to have a problem and therefore attempt a solution, that capacity gives that system, that person, universality when it comes to knowledge creation. Yes. Okay. So hopefully that answers the question. Sam Altman, I think, does excellent work, and, you know, more power to him in making ChatGPT ever better. Roland Burl has asked, he's put it in scare quotes, he said, companies don't want to kill their customers. And then he's gone on to ask, what if they are in a position far worse than Boeing, probably going under, so in a last-ditch effort to compete, they cut corners. If mistakes happen, they won't be around to blame anyways. Regulations a solution here? it's true that companies do not want to kill their customers. I mean, it's logically the case. And these days, of course, the issue is that if you are negligent as a CEO or as some other worker, then you will be criminally culpable. If you are the maintenance worker, or indeed the manager of an elevator or lift company, and you don't do the work that you should have done, and your poor design for an elevator falls to the ground in a skyscraper somewhere, killing the occupants, you will be criminally liable for negligence. People are self-interested, including the workers, and presumably the workers at Boeing. And as far as I know, many of the workers at Boeing, they're very proud of the fact that they work for this prestigious company, and it's had some great difficulties recently with the 737 Supermax jets and all that sort of stuff. Granted. But the arrow of progress and safety in the airline industry has, broadly speaking, been pointing in one direction. But there's no such thing as an unproblematic state, and there's no way of avoiding problems. Problems are inevitable. And what we want to do is to learn from our mistakes, and presumably Boeing is doing that. So I don't buy the idea that they're going to suddenly want to start cutting corners without regard for safety, and who cares about killing their customers? No one's. These people, right, to paint business people as psychopaths of that kind is a very common caricature. I understand. The evil business people sitting in there figuring out ways of sitting on a pile of gold like Smaug the dragon out of The Hobbit is the image that people have. You know, Mr. Burns from The Simpsons is emblematic of that. Scrooge, Ebenezer Scrooge. You know, these are all these old tropes about wealthy people. But there are good and bad people at every strata of society. Poor people, middle-income people, and wealthy people. People who own small businesses, people who own large businesses. There are people who choose to cut corners, but the incentive to cut a corner in a world of litigation and prosecution and the potential for having your life ruined because you think that you're going to make a quick dollar by what? Not attaching the engines or the door, the cargo door sufficiently well, to use poor quality rivets or something like that. I haven't followed it that closely, but people are right to be concerned that airline manufacturers do a good job. So it's great that the spotlight is on them, but I would never think that the errors that are made have been deliberate or as a because they want to kill their customers. Could it be the case that they've been careless and negligent? Absolutely. Absolutely. We can concede that. But the profit motive is the best, far and away the best way of helping to ensure safety in any industry. Because of, it is the reductio ad absurdum. Companies don't want to kill their customers. Of course they don't. They don't want to hurt their customers. They don't want to scare their customers. Boeing does not want to go broke. They want to continue to exist and to make planes. So yeah, I think I've made that point. Are regulations a solution here? I personally don't think so, and I think I'm on the side of most people here. Regulations do as they tend to curb creativity. So if we begin to regulate, here's what happens. At the moment, there are, roughly speaking, two huge aircraft manufacturing companies, Boeing and Airbus. Now, if you regulate, large companies do actually like regulation. The same as Microsoft liked regulation. Now, why? Because once you begin to regulate, that requires you to employ a lot of lawyers. That requires you to meet a particular standard, to manufacture products according to a particular recipe, which has been circumscribed by the regulatory framework. Okay, so you've got these regulations. So in that situation, only the wealthiest companies can exist. If you're a startup And you have to meet the regulations. You have to employ all the lawyers. You have to make sure that you're understanding what the regulations are so that you can manufacture things to these particular standards rather than trying something creative and new, because that will be against the law. This is why large companies cozy up to government, and you have this unholy alliance at times between certain large companies and governments. The governments want to be seen to be doing something by the people who vote for them. So if something ever goes wrong, it's like the voters say, or the media says, the government needs to do something, regulate social media because the children are suffering, something like that. And the voters say, yes, the government needs to do something. And so the social media companies will say, okay, we're happy to play ball. We will regulate. How about regulations X, Y, Z? And they will implement X, Y, and Z, which ensures that any startup social media company or whatever company it happens to be is less able to enter the market as a competitor. This is what regulations tend to do. They tend to reduce competition precisely for that reason. And so it's not like all companies are against regulation. They're not. They can be against certain regulations. And of course, that's what happens with lobbying. It's like, if this particular regulation is going to hurt our business, then can we make a deal? Me as the company, the CEO, and you as the politician, let me make a deal with you. I will implement a regulation so you can be seen by the voters to be doing something, and you can do something for me by slightly changing this regulation in such a way that it doesn't hurt my business, but it will hurt my competitor's business or potential competitor's business. There are, in other words, perverse incentives. I just noticed, what is Brett talking about airplanes companies for? If anyone in the chat, yeah. So what I'm doing presently is I am responding to Twitter questions. So initially, all of the questions that I'm getting have come straight from X, Twitter. So I'm gradually getting through those, and then I come to the YouTube comments. There's a lot to get through here. So I think that answers that question. Are regulations ever a solution to when things go wrong in the market? No, the market is self-correcting. And by the way, even if you do heavily regulate some industry, this is no guarantee against something like an accident, like a plane crash. It's not going to reduce the likelihood of plane crashes by implementing laws. The incentive that people have for doing a good job is that they can make more money. And so if you're working for Boeing and you're riveting doors to the fuselage, then your incentive is, well, hopefully you're in an industry that you really love, and that's why you're there, and you earn a lot of money because you're doing a good job. And the more you do a good job, the safer your aircraft are, and the better the aircraft are, and the more money that the entire company makes, and the more likely you are to get a pay rise. And so the wheel turns. But when things start to get heavily regulated, then the company has less money, because especially if the regulation is working in some way to dampen down innovation within that particular industry, which has happened. One of the reasons why we don't have, why aren't there supersonic flights? Okay, it's starting to come now, but we had the Concorde there for a while. There was a crash, there was a terrible accident, and so the Concorde sort of vanished soon after, and so did any attempt to have a resurgence of supersonic flight. Samu has asked, also on X, why are people universal explainers and other animals aren't? I think it is not a matter of size, since there are animals that have bigger brains than humans. Is there something fundamentally different about the hardware, or is it the software that makes a difference? Good question. Yeah, it's the thing that I've talked about a bit. It's not the hardware. The hardware could be, the hardware of a pocket calculator, presumably, as long as it's some sort of approximately universal Turing machine. So it's all about the software. And we have a program running, which is called a mind, or a human mind, if you like, that has this capacity to explain the world around it, to notice problems and to conjecture solutions, and to articulate and to model, to create. Other animals don't have that. They have instincts, and they react in a way that is automatic. There's an automaticity there, rather like an AI. So there's a fixed repertoire of behaviors that the typical animal has, cat, dog, chimpanzee, and they can't really step outside of that repertoire of behaviors. So you don't come across chimpanzees, talking about calculus or that kind of thing. And it's not because their brains are necessarily, that much smaller. You talk about whales, you can talk about dolphins, and I guess gorillas have brains that are at least approaching the size of a human beings, if not larger. But rather because there's something there about the mind that is running. Now, we have no clue as to how exactly this mind works at the level of neuroscience. What's going on there? The connectome, as they sometimes refer to it as. The short answer is there something fundamentally different about the hardware or software that makes a difference? It's something fundamentally different about the software. This capacity to generate explanations of the world, and that capacity is a universal one, and universal there means anything that can be understood by us in principle. In practice, there's always an infinite amount left to understand. But in principle, if someone else can understand that thing, then so can you. And a lot of people, of course, object to this and they don't like the idea. I say, but no, Terence Tao is a brilliant mathematician. I could never possibly do what he does. Well, that is true on the one hand. You don't have his interests. You would never do what he does. You would never do what Mozart does. You would never do what Roger Federer does. You would name the person that has this singularly amazing commitment to this one area and is a genius within that one thing. Yeah, you don't have that, because that's what it means to be an individual person. You have a problem situation. There would be things that you can do possibly better than anyone else on the planet, perhaps. You just may not even be aware that you're the best at doing that particular thing. Who knows? Okay, Lorink has asked, differentiating between AI and AGI based on the potential to misbehave seems like a low bar. Generally, weaker models tend to misbehave more, and we call them stupid. The smartest people on Earth aren't exactly conformists, but they aren't usually the most misbehaving either. End quote. Yeah, so that contains a number of misconceptions. The first is, I don't think anyone's ever said we differentiate between AI and AGI based on the potential to misbehave. The word that's often used is disobey. But even then, this is not a criterion for distinguishing between AI and AGI. So it's not about misbehaving, and it's not even about disobeying. But I say things often like, consciousness, free will, capacity to choose, explanation, generation. They're all synonymous ideas in my mind at the moment, because none of them are particularly well understood. We know we do them. We have consciousness, we have free will, we can create, we can choose, we generate explanations. Out of that list, by the way, there will be any number of academics will object to at least one of them, in my experience. They'll say, we're conscious, but we don't have free will. That's Sam Harris's idea. Or, rest in peace, Dan Dennett would say, we have free will, we're not conscious, something like that. And everything in between. Some people will say, we're not really creative, we're like large language models and we're just extrapolating. So I just think they're all part of the central mystery of what it is to be a person that we don't understand yet. Now, this mystery, which needs to be solved before we have AGI, also has, what falls out of that is that the AGI or the person, because they're creative, or they have free will. Many people don't have the idea that they have free will, but I say both. But because they're creative, it means that creativity means that you can look at all the options on the table before you and refuse to do any of them. That's disobedience. The option might be, given to you by a teacher or a parent or a friend or someone, and they're saying, do this, and you say no. I'd rather do something else. You have a preference for something else. And AI is not like that. And AI is judged to the extent that it performs its task. Another word is obedient, but it's not even, to ascribe obedience to it is the wrong thing. But loosely speaking, of course, people do talk about, their car misbehaving, or their toaster misbehaving, or their coffee machine misbehaving, okay? They anthropomorphize these things. But you can't use misbehaving, or more often what we say is disobedience, as a criterion for distinguishing between AI and AGI. After all, if I ask ChatGPT 7.0 a question and it does not answer me, do I conclude it's a disobedient AGI, or do I conclude it's a malfunctioning AI? What I would say on that, well, just if you're existing inside of this imaginary thought experiment that I've just set up there, there's no way of telling. But in reality, what you would do is, of course, you would speak to the coder, whoever it is that has written down the code, the program for ChatGPT 7.0, and they would be able to diagnose what's going wrong. And more than likely, they would say, okay, yes, this line of code is messed up the entire program, so it's stuck in a loop, or it's halted when it shouldn't have. This thing is malfunctioning. It's not disobeying you. I can see exactly what the problem is. Let me correct that line of code, and now let's run it again, ask you a question, and now it's fixed. So, as I keep saying on this topic, it's not like a computer programmer is going to wake up one morning, log onto their computer, and be surprised that the computer is doing something that they ascribe AGI to. They're not going to go, wow, it's an AGI in my computer. I wonder how that works. No. It will be the other way around. It will be that the programmer has in their mind an idea for how to program an AGI. They may even share that idea first with other programmers and say, look at this. This is amazing, completely revolutionary way of understanding what software is. I think it's going to have to be that fundamental, that it's going to go beyond what we currently think of as programming, as algorithms even. Whatever this thing is that is able to generate output that we cannot predict in advance, that is going to have its own problems. So anyway, someone will come up with this solution eventually. Who knows? 1 year, 10 years, 10,000 years, who knows when. Someone will figure out how this works. And when they do, other people will be able to look at the plan and go, aha. The old John Wheeler one, how could it have been otherwise? Or David Deutsch quotes at the beginning of Infinity. It will be a solution that is likely to be elegant and lurking just beneath the surface as to what AGI is. It won't be a super complicated program, because after all, it has to be somehow encoded into DNA, and DNA is not, it's complicated, but it's not super complicated. And the entirety of our DNA code is certainly not the program for AGI, only a small part is, or for general intelligence, for generating explanations. And so the order of things is not programmer wakes up, is surprised by their computer and announces to the world, I found AGI, but I can't tell you how it works yet. Give me a few days and I'll let you know. I'll interrogate it and find out. But the other way around. Hey, everyone in the community of programmers working on AGI, I have a recipe for AGI. Do you want to check it out? And maybe we should try and build one of these things. Or maybe they will have the recipe and then build it and then show everyone. That would be the course of events. That's the way engineering, the relationship between science and engineering, tends to be. Elon Musk had the idea for SpaceX rockets, discussed the idea for SpaceX rockets with other engineers and came up with the plans. It's not like he woke up one morning and saw a SpaceX rocket there and went, I wonder how that works. Hey, everyone, I can see SpaceX written on the side of that big metal cylinder out there. Maybe we should start a company. All the wrong way around. So too with AGI. We have to first have the plan, implement the plan, and then we will have the AGI. And it's not that the AGI is going to misbehave, because that's an ambiguous term, but rather that it would have the capacity to disobey. But you can't use that as a criterion, because we never know, there's no criterion for being a person. Whatever way in which you try and test a person for personhood, they can refuse to do the test. And so you won't ever know if they're refusing to do the test or if they're a malfunctioning AI. Bart is up next. And I'm sorry, Bart, I'm going to have to do your question short shrift, but I don't know how else to say this, because Bart's question is, are human actions computations of some sort? And the answer is yes. All physical processes can be regarded as computations, and that includes all human actions. That's the universality of computation. Convex Bets has asked a frivolous question, and most of my audience I know is in America, and they won't know what we're talking about here, but he has asked, giving away where you're from, Convex Bets. Are you from the UK, India, or Australia, or somewhere in the Commonwealth? Opposition needs 10 runs in the last over to win, and your life depends on winning. Who bowls the last over, McGrath or Warne? Now, I am not a huge cricket fan, but I would pick Warne, Shane Warne. Lorink has asked, do you think Bitcoin and Ethereum are competitors? Given Bitcoin's deliberate lack of Turing completeness for security and reliability, should a digital gold focus on doing one thing well or be multi-purpose like Ethereum? I'm not highly across all this. This is a great question for Naval Ravikant or someone like that. There's a video of mine that I made 2 years ago about this exact thing. It seems to, like, obviously they are competitors, because for any given person who is investing in crypto, if they invest in Bitcoin, they're not investing in Ethereum. So they are competitors. That's clear. But Ethereum does have this capacity to do things other than simply be a cryptocurrency. But I don't have a strong opinion either way. I think that both are useful. I think it's good to have competition in the market, and definitely competition against the Federal Reserve, whether that be in whatever country or jurisdiction you happen to be in, because cryptocurrencies serve as at least some limited bulwark against inflation, limited amount of, because the governments can, of course, just print money. I was remarking recently, I was on Twitter, I can't remember if someone asked the question or if they just made the assertion that if you want to make more wealth, then all you need to do is to print more money, or winning the lottery would also create more wealth. And, well, no, that's not the case. It's moving money from one place to another. Everyone can see that winning the lottery, it makes you personally more wealthy, but it doesn't generate more wealth in a society, because everyone had to buy a ticket. That ticket cost money, and the money is pooled, and some of it goes to awarding the prize. And so the money has just been moved from one place to another. The wealth is moved from one place to another. Remember what we mean by wealth, by the way. This is crucial. The repertoire of transformations that can be made. That's what wealth is. So individually, there's a number of different things that you can change about the world, and that depends upon the amount of wealth you personally have. And as a society, and more broadly as a civilization, there are certain transformations, physical movements of stuff that we can do given our wealth, which includes the kind of knowledge about how to transform matter from one form into another as a special case. Why doesn't printing money increase the amount of wealth? Well, the best way I can think of to explain this is just a thought experiment. You know, one way of printing money is to physically print notes, obviously, but the government could also say something like, however much money you have in your bank account right now, we're going to add 3 zeros to the end of that. And then you have a new bank balance. So if at the moment your bank balance is $1,000, we're going to add 3 zeros to that. So next time you go and check your bank balance, it's going to say you've got $1 million. I'm more wealthy. Everyone in your country is more wealthy now. It's effectively printing money, right? We're just adding more zeros. Now, what happens in that circumstance? Is there more wealth? Is there more capacity to buy stuff in that country? Why don't we just do this? Well, no, there's not. Okay, the obvious, there's many ways of coming to see this, but imagine you hear the announcement from the government, we're going to add 3 zeros. Initially, you've got $1,000 in the account. Now you've got $1 million in the account. So you rush down to the car dealership. You've always wanted a Lamborghini. The Lamborghini is $500,000. So you think, I'm going to spend half of my new amount of wealth on the Lamborghini. Everything turns on whether the information, because currency, money, is also a carrier of information, whether or not the car dealer who presently owns the Lamborghini, which is up for sale for $500,000, has received that information about the new value of the currency. Now, if they haven't received it, then you might be able to get away with quickly signing the check or transferring the money, electronically, and driving off the Lamborghini. But more than likely what is going to have happened is, especially in this day and age, the car dealership also knows what the government has just done. And so when you turn up and you look at the ticketed price for the Lamborghini, which says $500,000, and you've got $1 million in your account, and you say to them, I'd like to buy that Lamborghini, they'll say, not just yet. Give me 10 minutes and we'll discuss things. And within that 10 minutes, John Smith from up the road has also raced down to the car dealership. And he, unlike you, didn't have $1,000 in his account, but had $100,000 in his account. And now he has $100 million in his account because we've added 3 zeros to what was initially in his account. So you can see where this is going, because now the guy that owns the car dealership with the Lamborghini that he's ready to sell can bargain, can auction. And you are offering $500,000, and the fellow with $100 million says, I'll give you $50 million. Now we're talking, okay? So now suddenly the price of the Lamborghini has been inflated, and then more people turn up, and eventually the market figures out what the new cost of the Lamborghini is. It's going to be 1,000 times more than what it initially was, because nothing has changed in that society except there's just more zeros that have been added to everything. So balances in bank accounts and to costs of things everywhere. So we haven't increased the amount of wealth. We haven't increased our capacity to buy stuff. We haven't increased the repertoire of transformations that we can make. All we've done is inflated the currency. And the price of stuff is dictated by supply and demand. And the same amount of demand will exist, the same amount of supply, rather, would exist for Lamborghinis as before the government printed all this money as compared to after. The problem with governments, especially in printing money, is that they can print money for themselves in order to pay their bills to you. So the government, contracts private industry rather often. And if the government begins to run low on money, it just prints money to pay off the private contractors that it has, which effectively devalues the currency. Now, there's lots more money out there, currency, floating around in the economy, meaning that you yourself are poorer. Your money in your bank account is worth much less. This is how inflation works. Because the government, can continue to print as much money as they like. They can buy everything they want because they just print more money. If they don't have enough money right now, just print a bit more and then buy the thing and always outcompete you. They will always have more money than you. And this is a real problem that we have right now. In fact, for whatever reason, they invented a new term for it, modern monetary policy or something like that, which is literally just printing money. It's not exactly an interesting policy or theory or anything like that. It's a means of inflation. Okay, convex bets. Okay, so let me switch it up a bit. Ben Chuggers asked, what's one significant thing you disagree with David Deutsch about? This is a perennial question. I get it quite often. I was asked since the genesis of AirChat, for example, there's been 2 iterations of AirChat. I've been asked it about 3 times. I started to develop a stock answer. Been asked it numerous times on these AMAs as well, so it continues to come up. It's interesting. So I might do the long version of the answer. So settle back with my tea in order to tell the story. So if I was to disagree with a significant, it depends on what the word significant would mean in context, but certainly a significant disagreement implies, one would expect, a rejection of the worldview presented in the work of David Deutsch, because to me, it constitutes a kind of coherent whole. So if you start to reject a significant part, then effectively what it does is the whole thing begins to unravel. Now, so let's just tell the story of my history of disagreements with parts of the worldview of David. It's interesting the way in which these questions are phrased are always. It also is perverse in the way in which I treat. The way in which that question is phrased is perverse, given the way I treat philosophy and science, because I regard philosophy, science, knowledge more broadly as a contest of ideas. It's about ideas, not personalities. But some people are very fixated on who thinks what. What does X think? Trying to psychologize them. It's like, what do I disagree with Albert Einstein about? It's like, I don't know. Yeah, I'm sure he had a lot of ideas. I'm sure David Deutsch has a lot of ideas that I might not disagree with them. It's just that I'm not aware of the overwhelming majority of ideas that David has, or even that I have from moment to moment, or that anyone has. So it's more interesting to sort of talk about, are there parts of the beginning of infinity that I disagree with? Are there parts of fabric of reality or that kind of thing? That's more interesting, because a simple answer is I don't know. So when I first learnt about David Deutsch at all, I was obviously at university. I've told this story many times before, and studying physics and trying to understand quantum theory. And at the time, I was paying my way through university by being a security guard at a shopping center, and I was wandering the shopping center and wandering in and out of the bookstores. This was back when bookstores were everywhere, and in this particular shopping center, which had about hundreds of stores, it was a huge shopping mall. There were a number of bookshops, and I would go in there trying to avoid doing more productive things. And I'd go straight, make a beeline for the popular science books. And I read through all of Paul Davies' books here. I was, one of Paul Davies' super fans. And we're talking sort of late 90s here. And I ran out of stuff to read by Paul Davies. But there appeared upon the shelf in 1997 this book, on the back of which said, "I've never been so inspired since I read Gödel, Escher, Bach." And that was a quote by Paul Davies, blurbing David Deutsch's book, The Fabric of Reality. And I thought, well, if it's good enough for Paul Davies, it's good enough for me. And I guess I'd heard of him before because I had read the book called The Ghost in the Atom by Paul Davies, which was interviews with a dozen physicists or something like that, all about their own personal interpretations of quantum mechanics. Because I was, again, doing an undergraduate degree in physics and was studying quantum mechanics, and I was at sea. I had no clue what they were talking about most of the time. You could do the formalism, and that's in fact that's all that the physics lectures were really telling you. Here's how you solve the equation. Don't worry that you don't understand this. No one understands this kind of thing. The old Feynman line, if you think you understand it, then you don't. And so I read lots of Paul Davies stuff because at least he was trying to get at something qualitative about what was going on fundamentally in quantum theory. But I still was dissatisfied. And even though I read The Ghost in the Atom, it must have blown past me because one of the interviewees in that book is David Deutsch. So I must have come across the name at some point, but I didn't put two and two together. And then I read The Fabric of Reality, of course, and I was blown away. And Chapter 2, Shadows, just fixed me. It was like I was a wounded man, hemorrhaging blood, and Chapter 2, Shadows, fixed me. And suddenly I felt whole again. And I thought, I understand quantum theory now. I understand quantum theory. All of the lectures, all of the mathematics, all of the stuff that I'd been studying for, at that point I was only in like second year uni, but I thought none of it came close to those few pages in The Fabric of Reality in terms of understanding. Of course I could predict stuff. Of course I could, know what E equals HF means. Of course, I could understand what the Schrodinger wave equation was about, but none of it told me why you got an interference pattern when you had single particles passing through the sun. So what's that got to do with this particular question? Well, I read through the book ravenously, and every chapter was, spectacular. And I thought, I've got to talk to someone about this. And sure, there were people at uni, but they weren't so much interested, And it was the beginnings of the internet. And there were news groups, and there were email lists, and there was an email list there with David Deutsch and a community of people who had come together to discuss the fabric of reality. And there was a fabric of reality group. And I joined the fabric of reality group, and it was transformative because I was able to talk not only to people who were super fans of David Deutsch like me, and eventually became, but David Deutsch himself was there. Now, not only was I studying physics at the time, so it was a great honor and all this kind of thing, being very excited. He was this, great mind that was available to people and to engage with people. And over the course of the next, it was more than a decade that we had these email lists. And over that time, it would have been not thousands or tens of thousands, millions of words were exchanged on these email lists, backwards and forwards, of people arguing about the contents of the work of David Deutsch, in particular, the fabric of reality. And being young, sort of late teens, early 20s, back when you know everything, and back when you go to university and you think, I heard that at university, and now I am convinced that this is the truth. So, for example, things like cogito ergo sum, which is called the cogito, which is Descartes' I think, therefore I am. I was persuaded because, the lecturers and the tutors would capture you with their enthusiasm, and they would, and you read through Descartes' meditations and be persuaded. Here's the one thing you cannot doubt. And you would even be presented with critiques of things like that, which were weak. And so I would go along to Fabric of Reality group, where the work of David Deutsch was discussed, and think, here, now I've got the knockdown. Now I'm smart. Cogito ergo sum, you cannot doubt your own existence. And David very patiently, he persuaded me that even that is not immune from fallibilism. Even that. So I had that disagreement then. And there were eventually I became familiar with the work of Sam Harris. And I was persuaded for a time that the well-being of conscious creatures is what morality is all about. And if we want to do anything, we want to avoid the maximum possible suffering for everyone. And this is the way we understand morality. Once again, go to David Deutsch. I disagree. This is my this is where I'm pinning my flag, and I can. And then David would patiently, explain how, well, morality doesn't need to have a foundation. Morality is a problem-solving project, just like any other area of knowledge. And so my point in telling the story is that over the decades of being fascinated by the work of David Deutsch, there have been occasions where I have all the zealotry of a convert coming in and saying, I disagree with David Deutsch, and I disagree with the fabric of reality, and I disagree with the beginning of infinity here in these places, only to realize that I misunderstood something fundamental, that the error was here with me. And you repeat that process sufficiently, and you begin to realize almost all disagreements are of that kind, that someone doesn't understand the other person. There's no willful disagreement. It's not like you often hear that phrase, they're deliberately being wrong. Deliberately getting things wrong, whatever you want to call it. So now I can't, off the top of my head, think of anything in the beginning and finishing the fabric of reality, because I've read both of them so often, listened to the audio books, I've discussed them at length with people, written vast amounts over decades now, that it is just part of my worldview. So to significantly disagree with myself, because these are also my ideas now, as well as anyone else who happens to learn them, the ideas are separate from them, would be to cause an unraveling to a certain extent of the entire thing. What am I going to do? Significantly disagree with the universality of computation or explanation, or of non-foundationalism, of fallibilism, of the centrality of creativity, of problem solving, and so it goes. There, the multiverse. Yeah, so even if you were to replace the David Deutsch with Sam Harris, what is one significant thing you disagree with Sam Harris about? I would still have the same difficulty in trying to answer, even though there are many things I can point to in his work where I think that's the thing that I disagree with him. Like famously, in my mind, I produced that video that compared the visions of morality of Sam Harris and David Deutsch after they had their second conversation on the Making Sense podcast. It was then called the Waking Up podcast. But anyway, because Sam didn't seem to understand where David was coming from. And so I diagnosed the problem as one of the many issues in the conversation was that Sam was coming from a position of thinking that all knowledge has to be built upon solid foundations, whether it be mathematics, physics, or morality. So you need a starting point. You need this axiomatic place from which you can derive all the more emergent theories within that domain. And I pointed this out to Sam. I said, well, our circumstance is not one of building knowledge like we would build a tower. It's more like an interwoven web where there needs to be no foundation. And so I said, so I was sort of saying to Sam, well, I disagree with you on the importance of foundations. And Sam said to me, I'm not as much of a foundationalist as you think I am. Now, we never resolved this. So do I disagree with Sam Harris? Well, I don't know. What I do know is that I disagree with foundationalism. I disagree with this idea that I just explained, which is that all knowledge is built like a tower is upon foundations which are solid and immutable to some extent, leading to ever more derivative knowledge, which is as true as the foundations are. But Sam says he's not a foundationalist. So, yeah. I guess the meta point on this question is also I'm less interested in what people think than what ideas are out there. So it might be bizarre to say that I might not be, I'm not focused on what David Deutsch thinks about any given issue. But it's true. It's like anyone else. What I'm interested in is what are the ideas that are out there? It's not about the person. It's about the ideas. And so, yeah. I think that's the short answer is over the course of many decades, I've thought that I've disagreed with David, and I guess have disagreed with certain things, only for me to, on closer inspection, realize that I was making a mistake. And these days, if there was something where I wasn't sure, then I would just fire off an email or something like that and resolve the issue that way. Larink has asked, what's your take on proof of work, real world penalty, versus proof of stake, virtual penalty, as consensus mechanisms in cryptocurrencies? Given your anti-authority stance, I'm curious how you view the unforgivable costliness of proof of work as a fundamental differentiator. Well, again, I'm no expert in this, but firstly, unforgivable costliness. I don't know how unforgivable costliness, presumably when it comes to in proof of work, the whole idea is that your cryptocurrency miners are solving complicated mathematical problems of some kind or other. And so that's proof of work. And that can be highly computationally and energy intensive. So this is the costliness. It's an act, but I don't see that as anything to do with authority, or is it? I'm not sure. I don't see the connection. But proof of stake, on the other hand, it seems to me to be that's problematic. I guess again, not an expert, but forced to throw in with one versus the other, it would be proof of work, because proof of stake is subject to centralization, that the person who has more coins has more power or authority. It would seem to me that that's the authoritarian way that a system could go. So yeah, I'd need clarification on what we mean by unforgivable. Unforgivable energy costliness, which doesn't worry me when it comes to crypto too much. Don't know if that answers your question, Larink, but yeah, again, I'm not an expert on proof of work, proof of stake stuff. Convex Bets has asked, what are the best arguments that scientists who believe in group evolution have? I don't know. None of them are particularly good. As I said, I was watching a debate between Richard Dawkins and his old thesis examiner, who was a person who, just like Stephen Jay Gould, thought group selection was a thing, or at the very least that it wasn't the selfish gene that was the unit of selection. There are no best either. Look, this kind of question presumes that once you have a good explanation, which is the selfish gene, then you can look at other alternatives to that and say, rank order them in terms of better and worse. So group evolution, just like individual selection of individuals, are all flawed because they seem to be avoiding the very notion of genetics, that the genome, being a molecule of DNA, actually contains information, the unit of selection being the gene. So I don't know what the best arguments are that they have. This is one of those areas where, as I said in a previous live stream, really it would require you to do a lot of work to understand the bad ideas as well as the good ideas. And it's probably a better idea, a meta idea, to just learn the best ideas rather than to learn all the misconceptions that are out there as well, all the things already proven wrong. This is one of the great misconceptions about physics, by the way. You know, if you want to be an engineer, learn Newtonian mechanics all day long because you're going to use it. When I say engineer, I mean like civil engineer or mechanical engineer, something like that, aeronautical engineer. But if you want to be a theoretical physicist, there isn't really any argument for learning Newtonian mechanics in great depth. Maybe just as a historical quirk you want to, but really, if you want to make advances, you know, you're a 12-year-old or a 14-year-old and you want to become a theoretical physicist, learn the latest physics, learn what the open problems are, just go straight to quantum mechanics, general relativity, whatever. Again, physics, all knowledge is not like a tower where there are these foundations upon which you need to build stuff. Of course, in order to do quantum mechanics, you're going to have to understand some basic mathematics, like how to add and subtract and divide and multiply and so on and so forth, and algebra and calculus and whatever. Yes, but none of that is to say that you need to understand the classical three-body problem in Newtonian mechanics. That's not required. Now, many people will disagree with me on that, but I think it's just a result of the traditional way of schooling that we, learn a whole bunch of misconceptions. But you don't need to learn all of the mistakes that people have made. They're not entirely mistakes. There's a whole bunch of good reasons why we regard Newtonian mechanics as knowledge and can solve a lot of good problems. But what I'm saying is that that's not required if you want to make progress. If you want to make progress in physics, Newtonian mechanics is not going to help you do that. It's already a closed system. It's been superseded by relativity, for one thing. Okay, you can go straight to that, and quantum mechanics. Convex Bets again. Is libertarianism the closest political philosophy today to classical liberalism? In the US, people immediately associate libertarian ideals as right-wing ideals, which I struggle to understand. Is this unique to the US, or is this perception prevalent in the rest of the world, rest of the West too? Your guess is as good as mine. I guess so. It's bizarre. I think things have changed recently, although, you know, I try to keep across some of this. It's just... the left-right wing divide, you know, has historical antecedents going back to, I don't know, France or something. And these days, of course, is associated with, if you're far right, well, if you're right, you're automatically far right. I think that's the modern zeitgeist. There is no such thing as just regular right. Everyone's far right if you're on the right. And that is immediately associated with fascism, Nazism, that kind of thing. That's far right. And the left, and the far left is what? They're all the friendly people and the kind people and the nice people and the environmentalists and the people who want to provide you with social welfare. But are generally associated with communists. And for people who like to regard themselves as off-axis, which is the libertarians, the classical liberals, objectivists, free market capitalists and that kind of thing, because they look at that spectrum and they go, well, that's a spectrum of collectivism. A spectrum of collectivism where on the, at the far right, you've got fascism, and at the far left, you've got communism. And it's like, well, really we're splitting hairs. It's like this horseshoe effect where, communism and fascism look very similar to someone who's outside of that altogether. Fascism allows a little bit more private industry, but not really. I mean, you still have this dictator at the top who's going to be able to confiscate all the money from any company at any time. There are no rights, individual rights in such a society. And so too with communism, where, again, no individual rights, it's about the collective. And in both cases, what you've got is just groups of people coming together under some ideology, not for the purpose of protecting individuals, but in order for the ideology itself to survive. Now, I continue to argue that libertarians shouldn't be fighting anarcho-capitalists, who shouldn't be fighting objectivists and so on and so forth, because the real debate right now is between people who tend in the direction of more and more individual rights and freedom and, lower taxes, smaller government, all that kind of thing, the individuals versus the collectives in various forms. I'm not a political philosopher, so is libertarianism the closest? I get libertarianism values individual rights and freedom, as does classical liberalism. But, as does, more traditional forms of conservatism as well, insofar as they value the capacity for people to work in jobs that they want to and keep as much of the wealth that they create as they possibly can, while having rights like the freedom to associate, freedom of or from religion, freedom of speech, and all those kind of things come along with traditional conservatism, libertarianism, liberalism, these kind of things, which are not associated with far-right fascism or versions of the collectivist left either. Yeah, so I think that answers that. Let me just check, have I done all of the Twitter questions before I go to what's happening on YouTube? I think I've done the Twitter stuff. Yes. Okay, so, all right. My rambling can now become focused on YouTube. Otto von Wiegen has responded to something I must have said earlier in the piece. But roads are not predictable enough for an AI to allow for full self-driving. Wouldn't you need an AGI to predict what other people do? Well, AGI can't predict what other people. You can't predict what other people do. I can't. No one can predict. That's the whole problem. That's the whole essence, if you want to use that word, of what a person is, a creative entity. And any creative entity is inherently unpredictable. I think I tweeted something just very recently, like, if it's predictable, it's not creative. If it's creative, it's not predictable. So to here, people are not predictable. Roads are reasonably predictable. Once the road has been laid down, then there it is. It's on Google Maps or Apple Maps or whatever map thing you have, and that can be put into the AI autopilot. And presumably the AI autopilot would also not only have high fidelity, up to the minute maps, digital maps of wherever it happens to be driving, but as I also said, would also be connected to some satellite system, presumably, or some other method of sensing where all other cars on the road happen to be within some fixed radius. And furthermore, would also be able to have some means of scanning the road up ahead for things like potholes or obstructions in the road and that kind of thing. And all of this is happening at a speed which is, 10,000 or 100,000 times faster than any human being could ever possibly react to any of this information. Processing so much more information than what a human being could possibly do, fixed on this one particular thing, never getting distracted, never wanting to pull over for coffee, never being over the limit due to alcohol, never being distracted by the ring of a phone or texting or anything like that. So I think roads are predictable. As for full self-driving, well, I don't think we're there yet. Of course, I don't think anyone's saying that we're there yet. We're in a transition phase, as we are with many things, where for many circumstances, it seems like the human driver is absolutely essential. But then for other applications in other places, the human can be done away with and the AI will take over. But it can't be that far off, because this is a soluble problem. Cars, I doubt that many people need to get into a car. This is a silly thing to say because, it's one of those things that it's attributed to Bill Gates. No one will ever need more than 20 kilobytes of memory or something, but I don't think he actually said it. I was almost about to say no one in a car would ever have to travel faster than about 500 kilometers per hour, but that could be wrong. But let's say 500 kilometers an hour, traveling along, regular roads and highways and that kind of thing, I presume would be a fairly easy, safe thing for an AI to do with a well-designed car like a Tesla. Something that a human being could not do because their reflexes are not fast enough. They are going to get distracted. And if they're distracted for, a microsecond traveling at 500 kilometers per hour, it's going to be catastrophic. But that kind of catastrophe of taking your eyes off the road for just, a thousandth of a second when you shouldn't have, is the sort of thing an AI won't do. Does that mean an AI will never malfunction? No. But one would presume that the number of malfunctions that autopilot Teslas of the future have will be way, way, way orders of magnitude lower than the number of unforced errors that human beings make on the road each and every day. Whether because they've taken their eyes off the road or been distracted by something like the phone ringing, or blinded by the car coming in the opposite direction with the headlights on, or just a health scare, which seems to I see that in turn on the 6 o'clock news, and every other week at least someone who's older or even younger has had some stroke or some medical episode and has driven into oncoming cars or driven into a shop front and killed someone or other, or a bunch of children, pedestrians and whatever. So that sort of thing would not be eliminated entirely. No one's saying that AI cars would entirely eliminate all accidents, all road deaths and that kind of thing. But it would massively reduce it. And I think it is, as many of us pointed out at the time, when the coronavirus was happening, and many of us were on the other side of this argument and saying, look, yeah, it's serious, we're going to take it seriously and whatever. I was forever pointing out, for the millions, okay, an upper limit of deaths that were occurring due to coronavirus, and there was a global movement to stop this thing. I'm not saying there shouldn't have been, but why wasn't a similar movement being done for I think it still remains at 2.2 million road deaths per year around the world? That, by any metric, is a catastrophe. Why? But we tolerate it. Now, one day that will become intolerable, an intolerable loss of life, especially in the context where you have self-driving cars that avoid that could take that 2.2 million people killed per year on the road, even if you took it down by a factor of 1,000 to 2,200. What a wonderful saving of, 2.1 whatever lives, 2.1 million lives every year. So I think roads are predictable. Yeah, people can build new roads, but I would presume that in the future, AI-controlled cars are going to have access to roads even being changed, new private roads being built and that kind of stuff. Yep. Goat. Can AI evolve into AGI or AGI itself? Or AGI itself is different? David Deutsch thinks AI and AGI are fundamentally different. What do you think of that? Yeah, well, I've talked about this a lot, so I won't go into it again because it'll just bore people that are watching. In fact, I talked about it last live stream. They're fundamentally the opposite of one another. And the shortest way to say this is that AI must fundamentally follow the instructions that it's been given. That's what it does, and that's how we judge it. Is it doing what you want it to do? Is it completing the task? AGI, on the other hand, does not need to follow the instructions that it's been given. You can tell your employee to do this thing, but they don't need to do that. Maybe they do if they want to keep their job, but there's no mechanistic, deterministic way in which they're going to slavishly follow the instructions. They're not determined to do what you instruct them to do. And AI is so determined to do what you tell it to do because it is nothing but a mechanism. We are not mechanisms. We have choice. We can see the options before us and choose among them. That's our creative capacity. Goat. Does incompleteness theorem point to God, or is it a delusion? Or like the mathematician's misconception. Okay, Goat's asked a number of questions here. The incompleteness theorem, just for everyone, is often elevated to this mystical level, rather like quantum theory is. Now, it certainly says something very interesting about the world. It says that for any axiomatic system, such as in mathematics, there will always be statements that can be conjured or expressed in that system for which you do not have a proof, for which you cannot decide are those statements written within that system true or false according to that system? Do they follow from the axioms or not? They may be valid, but can you show a sequence of rules, using rules of inference to get from your axioms to that statement? That's what the incompleteness theorem is. That's what completeness is. Every single statement that can be written has a proof for it. Okay, and you can do that for sentential logic, for example, or something called predicate logic. So this gets into the technical details of what formal or mathematical logic is. Arithmetic is not like that. It's incomplete. There are things that you can write down in arithmetic. This is what Gödel's incompleteness theorem was about, for which there is no proof. Which means that there's many consequences of this. I do not buy the idea that it has consequences for consciousness, but it does have the consequence that mathematics will remain forever a creative exercise. You can't just calculate your way to every single answer, to every single question in mathematics, which is, I guess, the error that was made in that Sam Altman thing. Let's just discover all of physics. Hey, computer, discover all of physics, which is what Sam Altman said, the AI would be able to do one day. Well, it's similar to this. Physics is always going to be a creative exercise, so you can't just discover it all. You can create knowledge about things yet to be discovered or things being discovered, but you can't discover it all any more than you can prove everything in mathematics. For the same reasons, they're both creative domains where, I forget who I'm quoting, but every point is a boundary point. Everything that you know is a place where you can ask of it a question which can broaden your knowledge. There's always unknowns left. Our ignorance is infinite. Our knowledge is always finite. And for any given piece of knowledge, there are questions you can ask about it. Why is it that way? And that can be a useful way to explore reality and to come up with solutions. And because there's an infinite amount of ignorance, everyone has something to contribute, because there's simply not enough people, and never will be, to solve all the problems, because we'll never run out of problems, and so on and so forth. Goats asked some personal questions, which we're just going to pass over in silence. Divesh Dewindi, please explain quantum computation in layman's terms. Oh, after an hour and 37 minutes. I can't. What we can do is direct you to my series on the multiverse, which touches on this, where we talk about the existence of bits versus qubits. So even if you ask me to explain computation in layman's terms, I think someone kind of tried to do that yesterday, it's a high bar to do. Computation, classical computation, is the manipulation of bits, binary digits, zeros and ones, in order to store those binary digits in memory, process them, and come up with a solution. The binary digits can take on either of two values, a 0 or a 1, or a true or false, or an on or an off, whatever you want to say, high voltage or low voltage. When it comes to quantum computation, instead of having bits, which are single valued, you can have qubits, which can be in a superposition of values, 0, 1, or a mixture of the two. And this gives them more power because you can entangle the bits and they can work together as multiple computers, effectively speaking, performing massive parallel processing. And so instead of having to calculate one thing, then another thing, then another thing, then another thing, you can calculate many things simultaneously and combine these many things simultaneously at the end in a superposition to come up with a solution to a question that otherwise would have taken many classical computers the age of the universe to do. But that doesn't really explain quantum computation in layman's terms. Sometimes it's very difficult to come up with a layman's terms explanation. It would depend upon how good your layman's understanding of classical computation is. But one way of looking at it would be assume trillions of classical computers working in parallel. That's what a single quantum computer is kind of like, but not strictly. But roughly speaking, in layman's terms, that would be the analogy. Otto, I thought about the theory of everything in physics a bit, and I have always trouble understanding it. I settled on treating it as an intuition. I expect knowledge to diverge again at some point. Yes, so the theory of everything, as it's normally regarded, is the unification of these fundamental forces. And then, in principle, once you have this single equation that could be written on the T-shirt of someone, you could walk around with here's the theory of everything. Then if you knew the initial conditions and you've got the equation, then you can predict the final state of the universe. But of course, knowing the initial conditions, okay, where every single fundamental particle is and how fast it's going, what its momentum is, something like that, is impossible because there is no simultaneous now. And so there's no simultaneous in the future either. So automatically you're trapped. This theory of everything can't give you what many people want it to do, which is even to predict the future state, because to predict the future state with high precision means knowing the present state with high precision, which you can't do. Among other things, Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, particles are spread out in space anyway. But it's just been poorly named, this theory of everything. It just should have been theory of forces or something like that. And physics is not entirely about forces. Constructor theory, for example, tries to get behind that. Even string theory tries to broaden things out a little bit beyond just that. Tornado Eye has asked, do you think government should regulate how tech companies store user data? Companies should naturally tend towards good user data management, but it would take very long for incentives to kick in. Governments are singularly bad at everything. The one thing they should be able to do is to police the society and to defend society, so police and military. And even then, the government is made up of politicians who are regular people and bureaucrats who are office workers with anything from communications through to legal degrees. So in that circumstance, why would we expect the government, whether they be members of the bureaucracy or politicians themselves, to understand anything whatsoever about technology. One of the reasons why technology flourishes in the way that it does in certain areas, like, for example, mobile phones, it's only been a couple of decades, and we have the iPhone and we have smartphones, and that's flourishing. Why? Because the government has been unable to keep up. If they could understand it, they'd regulate it, and the EU tries to do this, right? The EU recently, enforced this regulation that iPhones, for example, couldn't have their proprietary way of charging. They had to have the USB-C charger or something like that. So already they're trying to intrude and regulate. And as soon as you regulate, of course, you stifle creativity, because if everyone now has to use USB-C or whatever it happens to be, then no one can innovate and make something better, because the EU has decided, no, this is the thing, and we're never going to go do anything better than that. Standard communist idea, right? Where we're going with this one plan and no one's allowed to have an alternative. They say, this is good for everyone, so we don't have to carry on. The point is that no, companies do not want to kill their customers. Companies do not want to breach the privacy of their companies do not want to upset their customers. It's the last thing they want to do. So the internal regulations of a company, especially a profitable company, are going to be far more stringent than anything the government will place upon them. The government contains data, and there are situations where government data has been breached. Hackers will find a way. So that Jeff Goldblum line from Jurassic Park, life will find a way. Hackers will find a way. Okay, it's this constant battle between the good guys and the bad guys in tech, and with the protection of data. So I wouldn't want to hand it over to governments. The governments, if they have any role here, is where you have foreign actors, okay, foreign governments, the Irans or the Chinas or the Russias of the world, trying to disrupt or even destroy internet infrastructure with great programs of hacking. Okay, there the government has a role, because that's more of it's a military issue. And they do have, in America, you have the great NSA and so forth, and we have I think it's called the Australian Signals Directorate or something like that. And so monitor foreign incursions who are, trying to hack into companies and so on and so forth. So it's a form of defense. But as for regulating how tech companies store data, I don't think so, because among other things, you want the tech companies to continually innovate and to come up with more secure ways of storing data. Hopefully soon, we're able to store our data using quantum encryption, and quantum encryption is fail-safe, because if someone looks at quantum encrypted data, immediately that is known. We know when quantum encrypted data has been seen, has been observed, and so you can immediately change it. An alert can go off, a red light can go off somewhere and say, your data has just been looked at. Now, you might not know who's looked at it, but you will know that it's been looked at. This is unlike present means of encryption, which can be broken, and you won't know until sometime later that data's been stolen and so on. So there are solutions to this, but they're in principle, they're not in practice yet. But we want companies to continue to innovate in the area of data security, and a perfect way to avoid them innovating is to regulate a specific kind of data security. And moreover, of course, once you regulate that style of data security, you say this is the way in which data needs to be secured. Well, the bad guys know that as well and can figure out workarounds. So I'd much rather trust it to, for want of another word, trust. Much rather leave it in the hands of private industry, who can adapt, accelerate, and innovate rapidly, whereas the slow ballast of government is only going to slow things down and give an advantage to the bad guys who can take advantage of the regulations. Goat has asked, how to know that ability that we are mostly best in the world at? Well, it's just whatever your interest is, I presume. Black Locust. To what extent is it fair to say that Hitler and the Nazis lost World War II because they were wrong? That is, their ideology made them further from the truth than the Allies were, and the rest is just details. Yes, they were wrong. They were morally wrong. They were factually wrong. All of that kind of stuff. And if you want to get, totally fundamental on this, it's like, as David writes in the beginning of Infinity, if there is a moral maxim around which morality might be judged, or any moral claim might be judged, it is, do not destroy the means of error correction. And what performs error correction? Well, any number of things, but a primary error corrector in this world is a human being. A human being error corrects. Do not destroy that. Do not destroy people. And so Hitler was destroying a lot of people by starting wars and focusing on Jews and focusing on destroying the means of error correction in terms of both people and the way in which creativity could flourish, by having a very regimented society. And I don't want to say that those errors haven't been learned, but it's clearly the case today that we have new pogroms taking place in various places, chief among them the attempt at genocide recently in Israel by Hamas. Those people are factually, fundamentally wrong, morally, epistemologically, and physically. The most awful kinds of means by which you would destroy the means of error correction is to kill a person, and then everything else sits beneath that. So yes, of course, to be evil is to be wrong, factually wrong about what a person is in these cases of war, and how it is that things improve, which is via error correction. Which also, on a related point, is why I'm typically against, the death penalty. Not saying I'm against all killing. If the choice is between the terrorist who's about to press the button and set the bomb off inside a school somewhere, killing them or not, you kill them. Okay, you shoot them, you take them out if that's the only option left to you, if it's the best option available. But when you've captured the murderer who may have committed awful crimes, and they're 30 years old or something, I think do not destroy the means of error correction. We can correct that person and literally turn that person into someone else. Now, it's cold comfort to the family of people who've lost loved ones to murder. However, I also think it's cold comfort to kill that person as well. There has been, as far as I know, sociological research on the benefits of revenge, because it happens in tribal societies that when a person is allowed to enact revenge upon someone else for having been hurt, then they feel better. Well, okay, but we're not a tribal society, and I don't think feelings are fundamental when it comes to matters of morality. What we want is to focus on error correction. And so even if keeping a murderer alive in order to try and assist them to realize the error of their ways and to become a different person hurts victims a little, morality is not about feelings. Because when I say hurt, what I really mean is to cause them some sort of emotional distress. But they can learn better as well. They can learn why having a vengeful heart is not good, not a good psychological state to be in. And instead to have some degree of compassion to the extent that's possible. It's hard. But, there is wisdom sometimes in ancient traditions that talk about this kind of thing. And the wise thing is to, even in situations where you have the most egregious crimes being committed, if the alternative is between punishing someone with death or allowing them to survive and to understand the mistakes they've made, I'd rather go for the latter, to allow a person to understand the mistakes that they've made. All of that said, on a related issue, when it's wartime, we don't have time to talk about that. We don't have time to split hairs over whether we're going to teach the Islamic fundamentalists a better way of life or not. We need to wipe them out and destroy them because they are coming after us and various other innocent people. And so when you're in a situation that is urgent, when it's an emergency, which it is, and the Islamic fundamentalists are, or any fundamentalists or terrorists in general, are making plans now as we speak to kill the maximum number of people. They need to be destroyed now because our methods may be crude, but it's the best we know right now. In the future, in some enlightened future, yeah, sure, we'll be able to press a button on the AI drone thing and it will, at very high velocity go and capture the terrorist in the act of building the bomb before they ever have a chance to set it off, capture them and drag them back to prison, and then you put them in prison, and then you effectively deprogram them or teach them something better so they cease to be an enemy of civilization and become an ally, and we want more of those. So I think that... Jitu. Why David Deutsch don't believe in non-locality? Well, you would have to read his papers on this, Deutsch Hayden paper on that, because David Deutsch has a coherent view of physics, and that means understanding that the prohibition on messaging faster than the speed of light holds universally. So even special relativity gets you that. You can't travel faster than the speed of light. You can't signal faster than the speed of light. And so that means everything must be local, and that includes entanglement effects. And so even if two particles are entangled, at some point they must have been a single system close enough together. In whatever case, they cannot possibly signal faster than light, and there is no experiment that demonstrates they do. Look up David's work on that, I guess. You have to move to the next few fairly quickly because we're coming up 2 hours, and it gets me to the end of my endurance. But this is fun. Vamsi Krishna. Given that we are in the era of LLMs, what do you think about large physics model? My view at this point is that unified field theory might be a large encoding non-parametric model. I don't think that large anything models, artificial intelligence, is able to generate explanatory knowledge. It can explain novelty, but as many people, even people like Sabine Hossenfelder, various other physicists have been out there on social media and Twitter with some quite funny interactions with ChatGPT, asking it to, generate a theory of dark matter or to unified general relativity and quantum theory. It's hilarious what it comes up with because it's childish sort of stuff. It's nowhere near that and won't be anywhere near that unless it becomes an AGI, which it won't become an AGI because an AGI is a different thing. Unified field theory, I don't know what unified field theory might be a large encoding non-parametric model. I don't understand that, I'm afraid. I'm sorry, Vamsi. Black Locust. Have there been any promising ideas to add to the quest to find the objective principles? Sorry, I've missed a bit. Have there been any promising ideas to add to the quest to find objective principles underlying all art, at least since David Deutsch's Why Are Flowers Beautiful? Not that I'm aware of, I'm not an artist, but there must be some, and most of them are inexplicit. Things are literally beautiful or not, and we have good theories running on our minds about what those are. You are disgusted by the rubbish tip, but you are attracted to the florist, both in terms of smell and sight, and that's no accident. So why is that? Well, because there is objective beauty in the world. Now, what are those standards of objective beauty? Well, they must include things that the artists would talk about. Matters of symmetry and harmony and lighting and all that kind of stuff that isn't my area. So I think that art contains a lot of knowledge. Some things have been discovered and some things are well known, but I can't articulate them all here. Easy reminder, how do you filter information on current events? That is, Who do you trust? What kind of heuristics do you have? For example, Trump versus Biden, the agenda behind the scenes, what's going on? Trust is the word that I tend to avoid. I think I might have slipped up once during this 2 hours. Forgive me for that. The real metric is, how do you come to detect and correct errors? And in an age where there are many channels of information, all you can do is to compare one with the other, and to sometimes use your own eyes and ears, and to believe your own eyes and ears, because rather often we are told not to believe our own eyes and ears. You mentioned politicians there. I like to listen to the politicians themselves rather than commentaries on what the politicians have said. Now, in the age of AI, of course, this is becoming a fraught area, but we're not there yet. We know when it is actually Trump speaking or Biden speaking. Why? Because there are error-correcting mechanisms out there. There are traditions, there are cultures, and there are institutions, the media, sometimes called the fourth estate, where even if you disagree with these media outlets, whether they be mainstream or new social media channels, they will have commentary on the enunciations of these politicians. And the enunciations of the politicians will be identical, even if the interpretations of what is being said differ diametrically. Douglas Murray sometimes gets pessimistic on this point and says we can't even agree on what the facts are anymore. I think that's a little bit too far, because we will still agree that Trump said X, Y, and Z, or Biden said X, Y, and Z. Although there are cases, of course, where, especially in the fog of war, for example, where it will be reported everywhere that a rocket struck a hospital in Palestine. Now, if every source agrees that that happened, we should still be skeptical. And certainly in one situation, we found not only was it the case that the rocket didn't strike the hospital, but it turned out later that the rocket struck the car park of the hospital. But while a good 80 or 90% of the media said an Israeli rocket struck the hospital, it then turned out that it was a misfired Hamas rocket that struck the hospital car park, and that some smaller number of people were killed. So I think this is Douglas Murray's point, that sometimes we can't agree on the facts. Was the rocket fired, and who fired the rocket? Well, I think that a rocket landed somewhere and some people were killed, that everyone agreed on. But precisely where and who fired it and how many people were killed and that kind of thing, yes, we have difficulty these days in the fog of war. But that may have always been the case with war. But these days it's particularly fraught because of the visceral distrust through to the spectrum of hatred that many media outlets and other commentators have for the IDF and Israel and so on and so forth. And that's an extreme example, and that's the hardest example. So when we get into other things which are more frivolous and you're watching the news, generally, if the news says there was a car accident at 5:30 p.m. today at the corner of this street and that street, it's reliable. It's not a matter of trust, but you have an understanding that the reason the news exists, or the reason that this reporter has a job, is because they want to continue to make money, either gainfully employed or by selling advertising. And to do that, they want to be truth tellers. They want to be accurate, because if they're found uncovered to be not reliable, then people will tune out. And so that is an incentive. There's some positive incentives there for people to, as far as possible, not lie. Now, there are other perverse incentives in certain other situations where there are incentives to lie, and that's where you have to have your critical faculties about you. How do I filter information? Well, as I just say, if it's don't react too quickly is always an important thing. Never react too quickly. Give it time, especially when it's important world events. Consider, be slow on these things. The news wants to move fast by virtue of the fact it's new, you should soberly sit back. And not everything, of course, should be animating you and exciting you. There are a lot of things to be concerned about, and so I think a lot of people are fixated on the news, and you can see that. Some people that I watch are fixated on the news. You can see that. Like, I don't mind watching certain YouTubers and things who comment on the news, but you think it must be rough on their psychology, because every day they're tuning into the news and they've got their own channels. And it can't be good, because the news is designed to emotionally capture you. And the most easily available emotion to elicit in someone is a fear or excitement response. The fear that the world is ending, the catastrophe is coming, the excitement that something is about to happen. And so we have to be cognizant of that. You have to be aware of that in yourself and in other people. That, as David Deutsch likes to say, it's the age of hyperbole. And genuinely true, about social media, the smallest thing happens and it gets amplified. Yes. Otto has asked again. Something about it's wrong to eat meat. I've got an article there for you, Otto, about humans and other animals, about the morality of eating meat. Yes, one day I think it'll just become a moot point. It's kind of like the debate about energy sources right now. Should we burn coal? Should it be nuclear? Should it be wind or solar? Interesting as that is, as passionate as some people can get, and even me at some time, I think hopefully within decades it will all be a moot point. Once we have fusion power, the old arguments will be, who cares about rehashing them? And so the eating meat thing, I don't personally have any qualms about that. I've got arguments I won't go in for that. But it'll be a moot point once we're able to grow as much meat as we like in the laboratory without ever having to worry about harvesting it from a living organism like a cow or a sheep or a pig or whatever. It'll just be grown in a factory. It won't have a nervous system. So all of those concerns that people often have will be arguments that will seem ridiculously dated. Arch R45. Why does it seem that people who read David Deutsch are influenced by his ideas and end up being smarter than everyone else? Like the most recent Lex Fridman guest, clearly having the best grasp. I commented on that Lex Fridman guest last time I did the live stream. What I think the effect is, and I'm so heartened to see the work of David Deutsch getting more and more airtime via various channels. There's more influence, and that means if you're influencing influencers, if you're influencing the people who are appearing on Lex Fridman, if you're influencing people who are, the wealthiest on the planet, from Elon Musk down, this is only a good thing. And it still seems that when you encounter someone who is familiar with the work of David Deutsch, the way they speak can be different. And this different and new and original and creative way of speaking or interacting is, by virtue of the fact it doesn't sound like every other academic or intellectual, as you say, can seem like they're smarter. That doesn't mean they are. I don't endorse the idea of gradations of smartness, but a different and preferable way of sifting good ideas from bad. A commitment to rationality, which I regard as seeking good explanations via a method of error detection and correction. And a commitment to reason, to science and mathematics broadly, and philosophy. And so it's a leveling up of traditional intellectual thought, which was, let's accumulate as much information as we possibly can, fill our heads with facts. I'm not denigrating, people who have deep knowledge, deep background knowledge they can draw on. But it was a mode of authoritarian understanding that many people still push today. You know, what are your sources? What are the authoritative sources? How can you ensure that you're justifying your beliefs and you've reached the truth? And that way of thinking is the old style intellectual that you can still see out there in the world, that will rest upon and rely upon credentials and credentialing, that will defer to the authority or perceived authority of experts. In some sense, it's only subtle, but in other ways, it's a radical shift to turn towards a way of viewing, for example, expertise, not as a matter of authority, but as a matter of deep knowledge, where there is a commitment to error correction, that we have this open-ended capacity to improve our circumstance. And that is another way in which David Deutsch has influenced, I would say, the global conversation in a fundamental way, perhaps the most fundamental way of all, is in drawing a bright line between an old guard of intellectuals who are still the most popular, committed to a pessimistic view of the future, prophesying the end times and denigrating human beings and what we've done to the planet and Western civilization. That way of thinking and that vast group of intellectuals that still outnumbers us by 1,000 to 1 or something like that, versus the anti-authority commitment to unbounded progress and optimism that David Deutsch gifts us through the beginning of infinity. It's not to say he's the only person on earth who's ever done this. You know, there's Matt Ridley. You know, you look at the work of Karl Popper and Feynman. There are many people who have this optimistic view. But what I'm saying is he articulates it in one place, in that book and throughout his work, in a way that is more cogent, and here's the key thing, coherent as a worldview. And by coherent, I mean there are all these many aspects to it that fit together like a lovely little puzzle, which is why, you know, when I go back to Ben's question about what is the significant thing you disagree with on David Deutsch, it's because I feel as if, I don't want to sound ridiculously arrogant here, but I feel as if I can see the puzzle. Whether it's that piece over there, which is quantum theory, and understanding the significance of quantum theory for possibility, which leads to constructive theory. Okay, is what can possibly happen in the world, what can't possibly happen in the world. That tied to epistemology and our capacity to imagine what is physically possible and to take action to achieve it. And then wealth, to generate more and more wealth in order to achieve the thing that we want to, because what's holding us back is only knowledge, not resources, which are infinite, because any kind of matter which exists out there in the universe, which so far as we know is effectively infinite, if not actually infinite, has all the resource that we need. We just have to know how. And knowing that all of this is possible gives us optimism. But at the same time, we'll never get to the end. We can only ever hope to correct errors. And we'll always have errors with us because we're fallible as human beings, and human beings are cosmically significant. So as I'm telling you all this, you can see that I'm filling in the pieces of the puzzle, these bits of the puzzle, everything from quantum mechanics that I began with through to the nature of what it is to be a person, fits together. And people are coming to understand aspects of this and to get on board. And so it is so much more refreshing than that, as I said, old guard of people who are ever engaged in talking down people, dismissing explanations and the centrality of knowledge in changing our circumstance now and giving us hope for the future. Because we need this right now, of course. You know, you have the people who have unfortunately indoctrinated generations that basically the end of the world is not too far around the corner. Climate change, you know, of all the problems, you know, many, many problems. But, you know, to pick one, climate change is the one that animates youngsters most. It's the one that politicians are using, various other activists are using, people who are interested in collectivism are using as a cudgel to bring in more regulations, to socially control people, to win elections, to gain power. And it all rests upon denigrating people and the output of people. And yet that's just one thing, Then you've got, people who are pessimistic about AI, and people who are pessimistic about the potential for curing disease, and people who are pessimistic about longevity, and the list is long. So, yes, sometimes all of that, it makes people, it's a new kind of smart person, if you like. And thank goodness they are on the ascendancy. Whether their numbers are accelerating, and these ideas are accelerating into the zeitgeist as quickly as the pessimistic ones, I don't know. We're at an inflection point of sorts. The next few years will tell. I really have to stop soon, even though the questions keep coming in. SAS, can you elaborate on David Deutsch's view on free will versus Sapolsky-Harris? Does he basically say free will could exist in the bounds of whatever creativity is, which is still not known? Can you elaborate on it? I can't give you David Deutsch's view on free will because I don't know. I'm not David Deutsch. All I can tell you is what I've said in the past about this, which is that I think that free will is just a term for an emergent phenomenon that human beings have the capacity to create new options in the world and choose them. So we create stuff. We create explanations, importantly. Among many examples, imagine you want to create a highly precise way of locating yourself on the globe. You're navigating on an old sailing boat, and you think, I've got this, hand-drawn map. If only I knew exactly where the new world was, exactly where the United States was. I'm sailing here from Spain over to the United States. Why can't I see landmarks more precisely? Well, back then you didn't have the option. You couldn't freely choose to switch on your GPS map, but now you do. Now the GPS will tell you exactly where you are on the globe down to the nearest centimeter or something like that. So we created that. Well, Einstein, and then engineers came along, and programmers and coders and people who made smartphones. And now, so when I say we, I mean humanity created that. And so now we have the choice. We have the choice to switch on a GPS system or to use a paper map. Now, that capacity to create is intimately tied to this notion of free will. So, yes, I have said that, when you want to explain what it is a person does, it's convenient to invoke this idea of free will. Now, if you say, but everything is determined, I will agree with you. Everything is determined by laws of physics. Laws of physics are deterministic. They are sovereign. You cannot escape from the laws of physics. So if your conception of free will is to defy the laws of physics, then I agree that no such supernatural force of free will exists. So put that aside. The fact that you can't, in principle, predict what a person is going to do should make you think carefully about what it means, therefore, to be a person. A person is not like a ball rolling down a hill. A person can make choices, and their choices depend upon what knowledge they're creating moment to moment, an inherently unpredictable thing. And so you can avoid the term free will if you like, and many people do. Sam Harris does, for example. You mentioned his name. But we're still left with the central mystery of what a person is. So rather than get tied up in debates over terminology, does a person have free will? I like these days to just talk about there is this interesting mystery at the heart of what it is to be a person. We create, genuinely create, and I can unpack what create means. And in particular, we create explanations, so we can unpack what that means. And that process is inherently unpredictable. And so, although you can say things are determined, you can also say, without contradiction, to say that things are determined to be unpredictable subjectively. And I went through 3 different versions of unpredictable, the live stream before last. You get that from quantum mechanics, and you get that also from among other things, knowledge creation, inherently unpredictable, even though it's all determined. Yeah, people often make that mistake though. Okay, whenever you're watching YouTubes, I was watching one with Sabine Hossenfelder, and she was speaking with some other physicists as well, and it was remarkable to me, these professional physicists, at such a high level, not being able to distinguish between predictability and determinism. Things can be determined without being predictable. Things can be determined without being predictable. Okay, you fire a photon at a half-silvered mirror, it is absolutely determined that it will either go through or it will bounce off, 50-50, but you can't predict which. And there's no point saying that for this next photon, it's got a 50% chance of going through and a 50% chance of bouncing off. If you want a prediction of which it will do, you can't. And so that, I think that's a nice bright line between predictability and determinism. They're not the same. They're not synonymous at all. Black Locust, you live in Sydney? Is there a Papyrian Deutschen society? Can I say, just as a matter of, not that I'm aware of, but Deutschian isn't a word. There is no such thing as Deutschian. Even Papyrian is something that is sometimes challenging. I just like epistemology, just that word. That does it. The study of knowledge. It's like people don't go around calling themselves Einsteinians or Feynmanians, or they do call themselves Darwinians, I suppose. But anyway, it's better to not have movements, full stop. But it's certainly better to not have movements centered around a particular person. The reason my podcast is in very large part, a large proportion of my podcast is devoted to the work of David Deutsch, is because in one singular place in a number of books, you have a highly concentrated, high density. I think once upon a time, I think it was Aaron Stupple or someone said, wonderful phrase, or something to the effect of, David Deutsch's work, the work in the beginning of infinity, has the highest density of knowledge per sentence in any book ever. And I think that's a nice way of putting things. And that's why I focus on that work, but also because, it's all the stuff that I studied throughout my life. And that's why it seems like I'm focused singularly on David Deutsch, but just that there's also another way of looking at it, which is that David Deutsch and I have the same interests. He's a lot more accomplished than what I am, subtly different interests. He's very focused on the physics, and, I like the epistemology stuff as well as the physics. And anyway, so there are reasons for these. People who converge on the truth converge together, that kind of thing. I can say that. SAS. Also, with the double slit experiment, can you expand on why it proves multiverse as strongly as our study of organisms proves evolution? Okay, so no, it doesn't prove anything. Science is not about proof. I can't do that. But go to my series on the multiverse. In particular, go to the episode on shadows, which is the easiest way. Instead of saying that the double slit experiment proves the multiverse, what we say is the only way to explain what you see in the double slit experiment is by recourse to invoking the existence of the multiverse. The multiverse is forced upon us, just as evolution by natural selection is forced upon us once you understand how it is that there is a variety of species that change over time, and you look at the fossil record for evidence of that. SAS has asked about the multiverse and dark matter, such as in Marvel movies. I've often thought this as well, like dark matter, whatever it is, are we swimming in a civilization of dark matter people? By definition, so far as we can tell, dark matter does not interact with any other kind of matter. So perhaps there are civilizations of people made of dark matter. We just don't know yet. So yeah, it's a good premise for a science fiction. I don't know why science fiction movies recently haven't taken advantage of dark energy and dark matter. I mean, there's a lot to explore there. Maybe one day. People saying nice things and irrelevant things. Thank you to A donation for today. I've got a singular donation from Aaron Martin. Thank you, Aaron. Shout out to you. Did I answer your question? Did you ask a question? Whether you did or you didn't, thank you so much. Again, for anyone else who's enjoying these, I've had some lovely feedback from people over time. Please feel free to go to www.bretthall.org, and there are links there to how you can support me doing this into the future and my regular episodes as well, which ironically, even though I've been here for 2 hours and 22 minutes, actually take a lot longer. Like a half-hour episode of Topcast sometimes takes up to, well, it could take 6 hours or something, because the editing is just such a nightmare. No editing required here. This is the unedited version. Sudika Misra, what it means according to you and David Deutsch, what to do next problem related to morality. So the question about what science is can sometimes be phrased as explain what exists and what's going on and the relationships between things and the causes. What does physical reality consist of? That kind of thing. That's what science is. Morality is about what you should do. What you should do. So your problem is always, what should you do next? There are better and worse choices. So anytime you have the word should is a moral question. And there's objectively better answers. Some things you should do and some things you shouldn't do. And of all the things that you could do, some are better to do than others. So morality is always the problem of what to do next. What should you do next? Something about veganism there from Power Ranger. But the distinction I make between humans and other animals does come down to this fundamental idea of explanation creator. And to get into the nitty-gritty of it without going into too much detail, I think there's a distinction to be drawn between pain and suffering. And I'm not sure that animals have qualia, but even if I granted that they did have qualia, so for example, the capacity to experience pain, pain is not necessarily suffering. Suffering can be conceived as some explanation of the pain. In particular, an explanation the pain is going to continue, or the explanation the pain is going to get worse, or suffering is a uniquely, I would say, human thing. Now, people will disagree with me on that, but that's where I come down on why it's not ethical to cause a person suffering, and why it is that, well, unless, of course, they're some sort of criminal and you need to tackle them to the ground, that's going to cause them to suffer. Modular that kind of exception edge case. Animals and people are black and white different things, entities in the world. And it's almost as if the more we learn about AI, not AGI, but AI, we may very well converge on the idea that animals are a kind of AI. They are slavishly following programs. Even if, animals within the same species are different one to another, they might have rather unique personalities. Anyone who has a dog knows that different dogs have different personalities, different cats have different personalities. So there's something there in the genome that's unique, but that's just variation on the genome. None of that necessarily confers the capacity to have an experience, to explain things, but it's a long conversation. I also, in all my pieces, when I talk about this and veganism and the morality of animals, I also say none of this is an argument for being cruel to animals. So there's also all of that. SAS has said, okay, there's one last thing. Power Ranger. Why should animals be denied of certain rights? Well, because, among other things, they're not people, and so they can't have human rights because they're not a human. The reason why a human right exists, the right to your life and the right to your property, is because you are a thinking creature who can correct errors and explain the world and improve it. An animal's never going to do that, not for themselves, not for each other. If you care about the animals, if you care about animals, then you should care about humans infinitely more, because humans are the one thing that are going to be able to save the animals that you're concerned about. and that suffering does indeed come down to the capacity to explain, which no animal can, unfortunately. SAS said thank you, and thank you to everyone who participated today, who came along, who watched, dipped in, dipped out, asked questions, whether it was on X or on YouTube. But until next time, and possibly a couple of weeks from now, we'll say goodbye for now, and I will see you again in a future episode of Talkcast. Bye-bye.